Kanye West, Prince, Metallica, Tricot, Lupe Fiasco, the band who did the soundtrack to No Man's Sky. This fucking guy. What do all of these people have in common? They're not creative. When Blade invented music in 2014, he decided that the most effective form of artistic expression in the medium was to make a bunch of songs that connect to each other in some way, whether intentionally or not, and package them with a single image telling the listener what the music is all about. The idea of an album cover being entirely blank can arguably be traced all the way back to the dawn of record pressings, when every album kind of just looked like this. Possibly the first example that most people think of in popular mainstream media, though, was in the 1984 mockumentary This Is Spinal Tap, in which their fictional album Smell the Glove had to be pressed with blank cover art because it would have looked like this otherwise.
Nope, it's not going to say anything.
It's just going to be like this, all
It's going to be
black.
that simple, beautiful, classic.
You can see yourself in both sides. I wouldn't feel so bad. It's like a Black Mirror.
This gag is also the reason why the actual soundtrack to the film was pressed with an entirely black cover, though there was still a sticker on it to signify what it was you were buying. While the entire Spinal Tap project was pretty much just a parody of 80s hair metal bands, it got a lot of attention from fellow musicians, especially Prince, because just a few years later he blatantly rips them off by putting out an album with the same exact cover art called the Black Album. Or did he? Prince's Black Album is pretty infamous for not entirely existing and paying for someone's college tuition. It initially began recording in 1986 and was meant to be a response to music critics who thought that he abandoned his funkier roots and sold out, as the flappers said. As a result, it's a pretty straightforward funk album that relies more on plucky grooves and big brass sections to construct an atmosphere rather than flashy synths and catchy hooks. It pulls pretty heavily from hip-hop as well, with Dead on It being a tongue-in-cheek exaggeration of 80s rap tropes, and Bob George having these weird spoken word passages over programmed drumming. It was slated to release in late 1987, with a few promo copies being sent out with no cover, title, or any indication that it was even by Prince at all. Right before it was supposed to be released to the public, though, he recalled the record because he thought that it was evil and that he was possessed by some kind of demon when he recorded it. In fact, the music video for Alphabet Street has a blink and you'll miss it hidden message saying, "Don't buy the Black Album, I'm sorry." Of course, this quickly became one of the most bootlegged albums of all time, which prompted Warner Brothers Records to say, "Screw you, Prince, we want some of them diamonds and pearls too." They gave the album an official CD release in 1994, though original promo pressings are still among some of the most expensive LPs ever sold. In 2016, a copy sold on Discogs for $15,000, and in 2018, another one sold for $27.5 grand, making it currently the second most expensive album to have ever sold on the site. Shit, if we can make this much money by putting no effort into our cover art, then why don't we do that? Said Metallica in 1991. James Hetfield has stated that they went with a minimalist design for the Black Album in order to let the music speak for itself and not distract people with a drawing on the front. Even though I spent all my time listening to it squinting to see if I could make out where the snake was, and then when I could, I realized it was taken from a political flag, and now I'm more distracted than ever! Regardless of all of that, though, the album still sold 30 billion copies in the state of Arkansas alone, proving that people like owning black squares. At this point, the floodgates for albums that look like this have been pushed wide open, so we're gonna take a look at a few of them and rank them in a tier list, baby. Spinal Tap is arguably the first popular record to do this whole shtick, and I don't want anyone to comment about this album or that album because they have words on them. I think it's really awesome that they committed to the bit from the movie and actually released a tie-in soundtrack with this album art, but a lot of the humor in these tracks does stem from how they're presented in the film, like the small Stonehenge bit or the technical difficulties in the rock and roll creation scene. Some of them do stand on their own, like Big Bottom and Sex Farm, which are well-written parodies of 80s hair metal songs to the point where they sound like they could have been actual hits despite how over-the-top the lyrics are. Also, the inclusion of Listen to the Flower People adds some variety to the eras that they're parodying, even if canonically this is an older song of theirs in the Spinal Tap universe and wouldn't have been on Smell the Glove, but that's not the name of the album, so I guess it doesn't really matter. It's a solid parody record, but one that works better in context of the movie than it does on its own for me. Despite Donda being so recent, it's arguably already the most popular album with an all-black cover, because it was made by the guy who had that verse on that Fortnite song. There was a lot being teased in the months leading up to this album, including massive live performances, leaked singles, and beautiful pieces of cover art that were tweeted out by Ye himself. Naming the album after his mother, who's no longer with us, and coming off of the full-blown Christian rap album Jesus is King, this record was shaping up to be a more vast and thoroughly explored take on the gospel-inspired sound of that album. The listening parties sounded cool, the colorful album art art illustrated this incomprehensible balance between our world and the afterlife, and it looks like this album could have brought Kanye's career full circle, as it harkens back to his more spiritual tracks that put him on the map, but now being written from a whole new perspective, as he's changed a lot as a person throughout the span of his monumental career. Then it showed up on Spotify one day, and why isn't the cover loading? Why are half of these songs still unfinished? Why is it almost 2 hours long with 4 song remixes that are labeled as part 2? Oh, Universal put out the album without his approval. Well, I guess that explains it. I'm sure he's gonna finish it up and repost it. Oh, okay. Look, I could see the artistic case being made for this cover, as it sets the record up to be this somber and bleak examination of the loss of his mother, and it lets the listener look at themselves in the reflection of the darkness. But damn, this cover looks so cool! You think I'm gonna drop $60 on a vinyl copy of an album that looks like this? Well, I mean, I think Donda certainly has its moments, but it really could have benefited from being cut down like Yeezus was, even if Rick Rubin wasn't the producer to do it. The updates in the deluxe version, like Tyler's backing vocals on Come to Life, and the inclusion of the phenomenal track Life of the Party are welcome changes, even if Kanye completely killed the pacing of the album in the process, but overall, it feels a lot more directionless and bloated than it had any intention to, and it's probably one of the biggest wastes of potential in music of the last few years in my opinion. Had some pretty cool music videos though. Metallica's Black Album was the moment in the band's career when they stopped being the cool, edgy thrash band that your mom hated and started making pop music for 12-year-old Britney Spears fans. But I think it's an alright album regardless. The riffs on there are pretty catchy and iconic. There's a lot of emotional substance to the songwriting, especially on cuts like Nothing Else Matters and The God That Failed. But I think a lot of the songs on here kind of overstay their welcome. I don't find the solos or song structures to be nearly as dynamic, energetic, or interesting as they are on some of the band's previous works, and while it is objectively very well produced, it doesn't have a song about Lou Reed cutting his tits off. It's not as watertight as a Paranoid, but it's significantly more tasteful than a Cold Lake. C tier. Prince's Black Album is far from one of the best in his discography in my opinion, but that's like saying The Magic Bullet is far from one of the best sex positions. The history surrounding this record is a bit more interesting than the music itself, with the biggest exception being Bob George, which is just such a bizarre sounding track that hearing it with the album kind of makes the rest of it terrifying despite being mostly made up of relatively optimistic funk songs. It's also interesting to hear him satirize hip-hop tropes in the midst of this relatively long-winded and free-flowing album, but overall, I think it's more of an interesting oddity in the history of Prince's career than it is something I have any desire to revisit super often. Still better than Metallica though. Tricot are my favorite math rock band of all time because they don't even try, they just be like that. I'm a sucker for math rock that actually has songwriting in it and doesn't only rely on being technical for the sake of being technical, because at that point I feel like I may as well just watch somebody do open heart surgery. Their fourth album, Black, or is just so freaking awesome. I've talked about it before in a couple other list videos, so I guess I won't waste too much time here, but this is honestly close to a perfect J-Rock album in my opinion. Every hook is super catchy, the jittery rhythms keep the sound of the verses really interesting the whole way through, and that bass player deserves a scented gold star sticker. There's a weird tinge of psychedelia in some of these songs as well, especially on tracks 6 and 9, which opt for a more minimal and depressing sound, helping the album keep its pace and its overall bittersweet tone. Despite the language barrier, this is probably the most A-tier album that has ever been made without having a cover. Dean Blunt's Black Metal is one of the most colorful albums of the 2010s, which makes the blank slate album art and abrasive title that much more intriguing. Nearly all of his albums that I've heard tend to be kind of all over the place musically, but this one feels like a celebration of modern music in a cryptic and one-of-a-kind way. The vocals are crude and amateurish, the instrumentals tend to be pretty repetitive, and the lyrics don't make a lot of sense most of the time, but it comes together into something that's much greater than the sum of its parts. It's able to sound super cheap, yet super emotive and dense at the same time. With the way the album's structured as a bunch of shorter tracks surrounding these bigger ambient pieces, it kind of feels like David Bowie's Low of the internet age, which might be the cringiest statement that you've ever heard in your life, but it certainly makes for an S-tier album. The cover art of Lupe Fiasco's Food and Liquor 2 is actually perfectly symbolic of how it continues to exist in the shadow of Food and Liquor 1. This is the first album that looks like this that I personally remember hearing, and I found it intriguing that he went with this cover, especially after hearing his explanation for it.
One of the main reasons why I did All Black was a song called Man in Black, written by the late great Johnny Cash. The reason he wore black was for the prisoner who's long paid for his crime, but he's there because he's a victim of the time.
Too bad it sucks! Just kidding, it's alright, I guess. I mean, it suffers from a lot of the same things that Lasers does, and that he'll talk about serious issues regarding culture and economics over beats that sound like Transformers f***ing each other, followed by an Imagine Dragons ass hook, but it's not quite as bad here as it was on there. I mean, it's pretty jarring on cuts like Lamborghini Angels and Cold War, which both could have been pretty good tracks had he rapped over more fitting beats, but even his rapping on here is a little sloppier than usual in my opinion. Form follows function and Bitch Bad, while both having interesting topics, flow in a way that just sounds kind of clunky and awkward to me. Hell, by far the best song on this album is Around My Way, which has a beat that's just an updated version of the classic Pete Rock and CL Smooth track They Reminisce Over You, but if you're willing to overlook that, it's a pretty damn great song. This is far from one of Lupe's best albums in my opinion, but the Great American Rap Album Part 2 is coming out real soon, guys, I promise. Now I know this cover technically has a crease in it, but I'm gonna count it anyway because it's a pretty cool album. If the name 65 Days of Static rings any bells for you, then I'm sorry you wasted $60. Before these guys decided that having money would be a good idea though, they made this album in 2005 called One Time for All Time, which is one of my favorites of that year. It's a very tasteful fusion of post-rock and progressive drum and bass music, a combination that's pretty outside the box on the surface, but actually works really freaking well. The energy is immaculate on cuts like Welcome to the Time, 65 Doesn't Understand You, and Radio Protector, sounding like the score to a film about a fork in a blender. Even the more straightforward rock-oriented tracks like Mean Low Water and The Big Afraid are really pretty slivers of post-rock that keep the album's momentum consistent. It's not the most diverse or unpredictable record that you're ever gonna hear, but at a watertight 9 tracks that doesn't even reach the 40-minute mark, it's a very easy recommendation for those looking for something wintry. And what better album to end on than with the almighty Black Album by The Business himself. I know most of you probably know this album with this cover, but Discogs has a listing for a 2003 CD pressing that looks like this. Checkmate, gatekeepers! This was supposed to be Jay-Z's last album. Again. But he really meant it this time, and in order to signify that, he symbolizes his career fading to black, hence the cover and name of the album. You can tell he really wanted to go all out just by listening to this thing, as it's a very tightly knit set of tracks that highlight his distinctly lavish and laid-back style in a more consistent way than arguably anything else he released during the 2000s. Also, looking at the production credits on here makes me feel like a freaking Marvel fanboy. The Neptunes, Ninth Wonder, Timbaland, Kanye West, DJ Quick, Rick Rubin, Eminem? What are you doing here? I'm not the biggest Jay-Z fan in the world outside of a couple of albums, but I think everything that makes him such an important and iconic figure in hip-hop is demonstrated here better than anywhere else in his discography. Better than Metallica out of 10. And there we go, that's the official ranking. I can tell just by looking at it that it's gonna ruffle some feathers, so, oh well. Maybe I'll do all Pink albums next, if I can find enough of them. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to fill this out yourself, and as always, if you enjoyed, you know the drill.
I love I do, I love the children too. Oh, thank you, Moulin Rouge.